Welcome back, everyone. In today's video, we're going to be looking at round 3 in the 2023 North American Open that I played a few weeks ago. So, you might be wondering, wait a minute, where's round 2? Well, I'm going to be covering round 2 in a shorter video because it was a shorter game, 60 minutes, and also it wasn't very eventful and it was just unfortunate. I got a really good opening and middle game, but then I didn't manage my time too well and I made some bad decisions and I lost the game. So in round 3, I'm trying to bounce back. I get a 1900 with white. So this is a great opportunity to try to put some pressure on my opponent and get to 2 out of 3 and then try to play some stronger players later in the tournament. So this game starts e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and we got an open Sicilian, and my opponent plays e5. So this is called something the Lowenthal variation. It's a bit more of a rarer line. You don't see this very often. Usually you get like knight f6 or e6 or d6. But e5, the idea is to just strike back in the center, and although it gives up this d5 square, the idea is to play d6 and try to play for this d5 break, or just to get a strong center for black. So I got knight b5, and I'm threatening knight d6, and my opponent allows it. So he allows me to get this check, and my opponent doesn't want to play king e7, so he takes. And now I get two bishops, but I'm slightly behind in development, and my opponent plays queen e7, trying to trade queens. So I don't want to trade the queens here, because now after takes, my opponent has two pieces, and he's about to play d5, and meanwhile I don't have any pieces developed. Now I can play c4, but this is a bit risky, giving away these squares in the center. So instead I play queen all the way back to d1, which is one of the main moves, and now all of my pieces are on the starting rank. So what am I doing here? Well, the idea is that my opponent, by pushing all these pawns, has created a lot of weaknesses. So I'm going to basically restart all my pieces and regroup and try to take advantage of these weaknesses. So we got knight f6, knight c3, now I'm heading for this d5 square. Now bishop g5, still trying to go for this square on d5. My opponent plays bishop e6, and now I play bishop e2, and I'm just trying to basically castle and develop all my pieces, and then try to go for this d5 square. But the correct thing to do here is just to jump in immediately to d5 with the knight, because after the pawn takes, I just have two bishops, and the idea is to play against these pawns here and try to get something happening with the two bishops. Now, the reason I didn't do this is because I was afraid of some sort of like f5 and these two pawns would maybe be dangerous, but that's just not really an issue, so I should have went for this knight d5 instead. So I play bishop e2, h6, I drop the bishop back to e3, we get b5, and now I play a4. So a4 is a common response to b5, and now my opponent plays b4, attacking the knight, trying to kick it away from this pawn, but now I play knight to d5, and my opponent cannot take with the knight because then pawn takes would be a fork, so my opponent is forced to take with the bishop, and now I take with the knight with the pawn, and now I'm very happy with my position because basically my opponent has to retreat with the knight. So my opponent cannot go knight a5 because then after bishop to b6, it would be attacking the knight and basically forcing it to drop back. And after a5, this knight would be very bad on b7, and I would have this b4 pawn as a target. So instead my opponent plays knight to b8, trying to reroute the knight this way. I play a5, and now my idea is to try to attack this b4 pawn and try to win it. Unfortunately, my opponent has queen to b7, which is a very useful move because it not only protects this pawn, it also attacks this pawn, and it also defends this a6 pawn a third time. And this is useful because a6 is another target for me in addition to b4, and when this knight moves away, this rook can also move away now because this pawn is protected. So I play bishop to c4, protecting this pawn again. Now I don't actually have to protect it, I can do something like castling, and if my opponent takes, I can play bishop to f3, which would win the knight through the pin. However, after knight, my opponent's next move is going to be knight to b7, and then after that, he is threatening to take the pawn because knight to f6 would defend the knight. So if I bishop to c4, I'm just trying to protect everything before I try to go for these weaknesses here. And I can play rook to a4 and try to play for b4 right away, but after knight to d7, knight b to d7, my opponent has this move knight c5. And for example, after queen d2, I can't play that because now knight takes d5 is a move. And if I have to protect this pawn, then after knight c5, the rook has to move away anyways. So instead of a bishop to c4, my opponent plays knight b to d7, castles, castles, and now I kind of see that, okay, this king's castled over here, and this queen is all the way on the queen side, and it's not really, it's kind of difficult to get back over to the king side. So my idea was to play f4 and just try to start attacking the king because this queen was far away from the king. However, this is the wrong idea because it's just too rushed, and I don't actually get an attack, and f4 just weakens a lot of squares around my king. So instead, a better move would just be to play a solid move like f3. This would be restricting the knight, and also it would be preparing like queen to e2 or rook to f2 to d2, which would protect this pawn, which is a useful idea. So just keeping it kind of less more closed and more positional instead of trying to attack immediately. And the problem with f4 is after takes and the bishop captures, my opponent can get the queen very active by checking me, which he does, and then playing queen to c5. And now this queen's very, very active. It's attacking a5, so restricting this rook, also attacking the bishop, and also putting more pressure on this pawn, and also protecting the d6 pawn. So now this queen is a very good piece. And by playing f4, now a lot of squares over here are weak. So I have to be careful about jumps like knight to e4, threatening f2, and also this e file, which black is a lot easier for black to occupy due to these targets that black has using the queen. So I played b3 here, protecting the bishop, and at this point I thought that I could just start attacking these weaknesses with b4 and a6. However, black plays rook to e8, and black has very straightforward plans, and they're very annoying to stop. So my opponent's threatening knight to e5, attacking the bishop, knight to e4, and there's just not very many ways to deal with this. For example, rook to e8 wouldn't be ideal because after takes, first of all, I might be hanging this pawn, but also knight to e5 is a move. Knight to e4 is still a move here. That would be very dangerous. So I played queen to d3, attacking a6, hoping that my opponent just panics and tries to defend it with like, I don't actually know how my opponent would even defend the pawn. But my opponent plays knight to e5 instead, which is a fork, and it basically forces me to take. And after rook takes e5, white's advantage with the queenside weaknesses has basically disappeared, and my opponent offers a draw here. And obviously here I should accept the draw because black is obviously much better. Black has a safer king, and actually black has probably a better pawn structure. However, I didn't want to accept the draw, so I played rook f4 instead. I'm trying to stop the knight from coming into f2. And now my opponent takes this pawn, and now I have one final chance to make a draw with either rook to f5, and after this trade, this endgame is probably a draw because now the rook is tied down to a6, or queen to f3, which would be another interesting move, attacking f7 and taking advantage of this pin. And then, even though black's up a pawn, white doesn't have any. White has less problems with the king now, so it's probably okay for white instead of what I did in the game, which is play rook to d4, trying to win this pawn and try to win this pawn and try to generate some winning chances. But this runs into knight to e3, which is a very strong move. And I saw knight to e3, and I wasn't too worried about it because I thought that after takes and takes, I would maybe have rook to d5, trying to create a passed pawn. And this did end up happening in the game where it takes d6, but what I missed was a little tactical nuisance, and you can try to pause the video and see what was it that I missed, which is very bad. Okay, so if you found that this idea of, so first of all, if you notice that the king is kind of stuck behind the pawns, there are some back rank possibilities. Congratulations for noticing that. That's a very good tactical thing to notice. And also this rook is ready to jump in here. So black can actually just take this pawn immediately with queen takes a5. And if I take, then that would run into a back rank checkmate. So I would get ice skated on the back rank here. And I completely missed this. I didn't see this at all. And my opponent did see this, but instead he played rook to e8 first, threatening rook e1. And I can't play h3 because after check, my opponent can check queen to g1 and then rook to e3 would win the queen. So I can't play h3 to create any lift or error. Instead, I have to play rook to d8, trying to pin the rook to the king. And after rook to e1, I can actually take because the rook is pinned. However, my opponent now can play queen to 8. Queen takes a5, which is a very flashy move, attacking the rook on a1 and the rook on d8 at the same time. So now I have to take, and I cannot take because of rook to e1 check, so I have to move the queen back. And at this point, I'm down a pawn, but I'm not just down a pawn. I have a weaker king, I have doubled c-pawns, and black has this passed a-pawn, which is going to push very quickly. So we get queen to c5, I still cannot take this pawn on a6 because queen takes c4 would be very, very devastating. Still taking advantage of this back rank threat. So I play h3, and now my opponent starts pushing these pawns. And we're going to see that my opponent is a very good endgame player, and he makes a lot of very strong moves in this endgame, and he just plays it very, very accurately and any takes away any counterplay that I have, basically. So I play queen to d3, and my opponent attacks this pawn. Queen to d2, so I'm trying to just, if my opponent takes this pawn, at least I can take away the a-pawn. We get rook to a8, now queen d7, and now still if my opponent takes, I can play rook takes a5, taking advantage of this fork, and that would give me a lot of drawing chances if these pawns get traded. So my opponent plays queen to e5 now, attacking this rook, and now I play rook f1, threatening f7. So I'm trying to generate counterplay on this f7 pawn. My opponent plays queen to e8, protecting the pawn, and now I get queen to b7, and now I'm getting a little more optimistic here because I see this tactic of rook takes f7, and if the queen takes, then the rook would be hanging in the corner. So this is basically my last chance to try to generate some drawing chances. We get rook to b8, queen a7, still keeping an eye on this rook, and threatening rook takes f7. And now my opponent plays a4, still pushing these pawns. And right now, I don't have to play rook takes f7. I can try to play c5 and push my own pawn. But I just saw that this pawn was just pushing very quickly. So I just tried to create something. And if it doesn't work, then I have a bad position anyways. I was probably going to lose the game anyway, so might as well just try something crazy and see what happens. So I play rook takes f7, we get queen takes b8, check, and this looks like a fork, but unfortunately queen to f8 guards the pawn. And now I spend a lot of time trying to figure out where to put my queen. So the main problem is this pawn on the a file. How am I going to try to stop the pawn? Well, I can try to put the queen behind the pawn on a7, but after queen to f7 queen to f1 check, this pawn is just going to push, and once my opponent moves the queen like b2 or something, this pawn is just going to promote. So the idea I found is to play queen to e5, centralizing the queen, but also covering the pawn on the backwards diagonal. And the idea is after a3 or something, to try to push this pawn to create counterplay against the queen, and just try to lure the queen away. And with the queen on a1, if the pawn ever pushes, I can try to take this pawn. So the queen, and with this, my idea was after a2, something like this. After queen f7, it's very difficult for black to move the queen in a position to force the pawn to promote, and that's because the queen has to protect the pawn. So in a position like this, which is what I was hoping for, I could play c6, and black can't would like to get the queen to b1, but this pawn on c2 covers the b3 square. So in a position like this, I would actually be just in time because after c7, it looks like black can play queen to b1, but I can play king to h2, and then in just many positions like this, even though black wins a queen, I can make a queen myself, and I can get a perpetual because of the unfortunate positioning of this queen. So this is like the dream position I was hoping for. But obviously my opponent doesn't have to do this, and my opponent probably definitely saw this queen to a1 idea. So instead, he plays queen to f1 check first, and now there are two moves that win for black. So see if you can pause the video and find at least one of them. Okay, so if you said a2, then that is indeed a winning move, and that is the move that my opponent chose. And if you said queen to c4, that is also winning, and I think this move is even better because just optically and thematically, it's a very nice move. And the idea behind queen c4 is it stops this pawn from pushing. It also attacks this pawn on c2. It also takes away the checking diagonal for this queen, so it improves the king safety. And also, yeah, it just these three things is just what makes queen c4 very strong. And it's also threatening a2, taking the pawn, and then queen b1. So my opponent plays a2 instead, which looks like it runs into a fork, but it doesn't. After queen to d5 check, black can play queen to f7, guarding the pawn. I'll play queen d4, queen c7 check, which is a very nice move because if I play g3, that's not what I want to do because now after queen e7, my opponent's threatening to check, and then check again, and then promote. So I play king to h1, queen a7. Now my opponent forces me to play queen a1, and it looks like now it's this kind of a similar position to the position with the queen on f7, where I could play c6, c7 to take this pawn. However, my opponent has queen to a4, taking this pawn, and then queen to b1, and my opponent is just slightly faster. So I'll play c7, and queen to b1, I could maybe try to hope for king h2, and then c8 with a perpetual. But my opponent doesn't have to do this. Instead, my opponent can play b3, can play this move b3, which just kills all my counterplay, and now my opponent just basically can take this pawn. So I play queen e5, trying to like check or something, but my opponent just sacrifices the queen, checks queens with check, and then plays queen b1, which is another very nice thematic endgame move, cutting off, just taking control of this diagonal where with all my checks. So now the king can hide on h7, queen c2, and push this pawn. So at this point, I resign the game because I'm just really tired from defending, and now I just know that this position is just going to be losing, so I resign the game. But now there is one more trick that I could try, which is maybe like queen c6 or something, and after queen c2, queen a4, which would be a pin. And it's actually kind of annoying to get stop this idea because after queen a2, there's like queen c4, and then there's still this pin. But it is winning if black finds the right checks and then pushes a pawn or something. And this is losing for white. So I resign the game and I lose a second game in a row, and that's not very ideal. So I'm now on 1 out of 3, and now it's very important to win a couple games to try to get myself back in the tournament and try to play some strong players and gain some rating, which is the ultimate goal. So that was round 3. Kind of an unfortunate game, but my opponent played very well and he was very deserving to win this game. So I'll probably make a short on round 2, and then we'll look at round 4 in the next video. So thank you everyone for watching.